So, having looked at the topic 4.1, now it comes to topic 4.2 that is focusing on the characteristics of a conceptual framework. So, what are those characteristics that distinguish or make distinct a conceptual framework? So, a conceptual framework is more specific and concrete than a theory. Usually, a theory theorizes or generalizes some aspect, whereas a conceptual framework is much more specific in explanation and much more concrete in what it presents when it is presenting a relationship that exists among the different variables. Also, a conceptual framework can usually be shown in a diagram or a picture. So usually it is much better to present it in a diagram or a picture because the diagram or a picture can easily show the relationship that exists among the different variables that may not easily be described narratively. But what is recommended is that when you have presented a diagram or a picture, then you also present a narration of it such that the reader can be able to see the relationship that you are explaining in the diagram or the picture. And also, a conceptual framework could be populated by multiple theories at multiple levels. So that's why I mentioned that when you have a conceptual framework, you can be able to also integrate it with some theories. And in that case, it will be a hybrid conceptual stroke theoretical framework, depending on how innovative you think about the different assumptions and the different theories that underpin your research. Also, the conceptual framework can be developed and constructed through a process of qualitative analysis. Of course, we shall see in the other subsequent subtopics how to develop and construct a theoretical, rather a conceptual framework, stroke a theoretical framework. Then also, we see that a conceptual framework is not merely a collection of concepts, but rather a construct in which each concept plays an integral role. So, for every conceptual framework that you have, as the name suggests, there must be different concepts. So, those concepts are the ones which are brought together to show the explanation that exists in their relationship. Also, a conceptual framework lays out the key factors, constructs, or variables and presumes relationships among them. So the most important aspect of the conceptual framework is to show the different relationships that exist among the different variables that you have identified. And then also, it provides not a causal or analytical setting, but rather an interpretive approach. So usually, it is not enough to mention that this is related to this, or A is related to B, or A and B are related. But it is important to mention the interpretive nature of that relationship. How are they related? And that aspect of how they are related is what you should be able to put together in the narration to the conceptual framework that is presented in form of a picture or an illustration. So this means that the conceptual framework is not just about presenting the relationship, but also to interpret that relationship such that once you have made logical interpretations, logical predictions, it helps to be able to further investigate those interpretations that you have made in reality, and that is what we call social reality. Remember, when it comes to a conceptual framework, usually it is more utilized in social researches much more than natural science researches. The reason is that in the natural science researches, usually researchers rely on a hypothesis. Hypothesis is also almost similar to a conceptual framework. The only difference is that it is simplified. So that's why, for example, when it comes to the conceptual framework, you'll be able to construct it, and it is much more elaborative than a hypothesis. I continue with the characteristics of the conceptual framework. Rather than offering a theoretical explanation as do quantitative models, conceptual framework provide understanding. So this also again adds on what I had mentioned previously, that in natural sciences, usually where we utilize statistical tests, where we utilize quantitative methods, where we utilize quantitative models, we find that we use hypotheses. But when it comes to social studies, where we come to social researches, we find that we adopt the conceptual frameworks much better because we are interested much more in understanding, especially in understanding the underlying factors. We are not just interested in understanding the relationship, but we are even much more interested in understanding why the relationship. And when we pose the why questions, we find that we are moving from the quantitative to qualitative, where we find explanations, where we can be able to tell stories, and also find a number of various factors that are underpinning a certain research, and also to be able to explain certain observations. Also, a conceptual framework provides not knowledge of hard facts, but rather soft interpretations of intentions. So that's why it is much common, as I have already mentioned, for you to utilize conceptual frameworks when you are studying complex problems, complex issues. Those are usually, for example, issues to do with certain aspects in society that you are interested in, much more than simply running a statistical test. So that is why it is important that for a conceptual framework, you are not just looking for what is, or just looking for if there is any relationship among the variables, or if there is a relationship that is causal, but rather what is important is the interest in the interpretations of the intentions, looking for the reasons behind certain things. Also, the conceptual frameworks are indeterministic in nature, and therefore are not intended to enable us predict an outcome. Their purpose mainly is to explain, is to explore something. So that is why it is important that when you use a conceptual framework, overall, you come up with the different understandings, not just the predictions. So that is why with a conceptual framework, at the end of the day, when you have adopted it in your research, you should be able to piece together the different components of your research into a holistic whole, other than simply testing uh, one or two components. You'll find that if you have to combine the qualitative and quantitative uh, aspects of your research together, at the conceptual level, you can be able to identify one line of the relationship of one variable with another, but at the end of the day, all the different lines that constitute your conceptual framework should be able to explain a holistic picture. So this has been our topic 4.2, where I have described the characteristics of a conceptual framework.